I found her by the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. That's the only way I've ever been able to explain it to anyone who's asked, and plenty have asked, because it isn't the kind of thing a king is supposed to say out loud in front of his own council. My scouts had lost her twice on the switchbacks of the Hollow Road that night, and they were not bad trackers. I have never kept bad trackers. It is one of the few luxuries I've never let myself skimp on, but she moved through that broken stone like the mountain itself had raised her, choosing footing that didn't exist until her boot found it, vanishing into folds of rock that looked, to any eye trained on flat ground, like nothing but shadow. I caught the smell of ozone and wet stone and cold iron a half-mile before the storm actually broke over the ridge, and I knew, the way I know very few things with that kind of certainty, exactly where a person running from dogs and torches would choose to go to disappear. I was right. I usually am about things like that. It is a talent that has served me well and cost me more than I like to admit, because instinct that good tends to make a man overconfident about the things it can't actually tell him. And there was a great deal about that night I did not yet understand, though I would have sworn, riding hard through the dark with rain starting to needle down through the pines, that I already knew everything that mattered. She had a knife out and pointed at my chest before I'd finished swinging down off my horse. Not brandished, held, the way a person holds a tool they've used enough times that it stopped being frightening to them and started being simply useful. "Another step," she said, low and even, no tremor in it at all, "and I put this somewhere you'll feel it for a week." "I believe you," I said and meant it, and did not take the step. Behind me I heard my guard captain, Rennet, shift his weight, hand drifting toward his own blade, and I lifted 2 fingers without turning hold, because something in the set of her shoulders told me that if steel came out on our side, this conversation would end in blood I didn't want spilled, mine or hers, before I'd learned a single useful thing about who she was or why she'd chosen tonight, of all nights, to run the Hollow Road in a storm. "You're trespassing on a closed road," I said, "under my authority. That road's been shut for 20 years. Roads don't close." Her eyes never left mine, and in the last gray light before full dark took the ridge, I could see she was younger than her voice had made me expect. Not a girl, but not far past it either, with a hunter's leanness and a scar along one forearm she hadn't bothered to hide beneath her sleeve, the kind of mark that comes from a blade slipping in bad weather, not from a fight. People just stop telling the truth about where they lead. There's a difference. My mother taught me that difference when I was young enough that I still believed kings were the ones who got to decide what was true. And now I've had 20 years to learn better. I have ruled Emberhold for 11 of those years. In that time, I have negotiated with ambassadors who wanted my throat as much as my signature, faced down a rival alpha's challenge in a hall gone silent enough to hear a torch gutter, and once spent an entire miserable evening being cursed at, creatively and at great length, by a merchant whose cargo I'd confiscated for smuggling weapons through a border village. None of it prepared me for the way this forest-born stranger looked at me across 6 feet of wet stone in the last light of a dying afternoon. Not with fear, not with the careful deference my own court had trained into every face around me for over a decade, but with the flat, assessing patience of someone who had already decided, a long time ago, that kings were a problem to be managed rather than a power to be feared. I should have had Rennet take her into custody. That is what every rule I'd inherited, every precedent my father had left behind, every ounce of good sense in my own head told me to do. Instead, I heard myself say, "Put the knife away. Come to the hold. Dry off, eat something, and answer some questions I think you have better answers to than anyone else alive. After that, if you still want to run, I won't stop you." She laughed, one short, disbelieving breath of a sound, no warmth in it at all. "You'll forgive me if being invited inside a king's walls has never gone well for anyone in my family." I didn't know yet how true that sentence was. I only knew that something in my chest had gone quiet in a way I didn't have a word for, not the sharp prickle of danger sensed, Not the low hum of a court intrigue I could smell coming from 3 rooms away, but something closer to the feeling of walking into a room and realizing, before you've consciously registered why, that someone important has just entered it behind you. I had felt nothing like it before. I would spend the better part of the next year trying and failing to describe it to anyone who asked, and eventually I stopped trying, because some things don't survive being turned into words. "I'm not asking as a courtesy," I said. "I'm asking because you know something about that road that I don't, and 20 years of not knowing it has never once sat right with me, whatever my father's court decided to call settled." That got something. Not much. The knife didn't lower, not yet, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of the same unwilling curiosity I felt looking at her. "Senna," she said finally, sheathing the blade with a motion too practiced to be anything but old habit. "That's my name, since you'll want one for your ledgers. I'll come, not because I trust you. Because I want to see what a king who says a thing like that actually does about it." "Fair enough," I said, and turned to lead her down off the ridge before the storm broke in earnest, feeling Rennett's eyes on my back the whole way, full of a question he was too well trained to ask aloud. The ride back to the hold took the better part of 2 hours, most of it in silence, Rain finally finding us somewhere past the old boundary marker where the road bends around the shoulder of the mountain. She rode behind one of my scouts, not touching him more than she had to, watching the dark tree line slide by with the wary attention of someone counting every possible way out of a trap she'd walked into with her eyes open. I watched her when I thought she wouldn't notice, and caught her doing the same to me twice, and both times we looked away at exactly the same moment, which struck me, even soaked through and half frozen, as a strange kind of symmetry to find in a stranger. By the time we reached the gates, the storm had settled into a steady gray hiss, and the hold's lamplight looked, I imagine, almost gentle to eyes that had spent a lifetime avoiding it. She didn't say so. She said nothing at all as we crossed the courtyard, nothing as servants took our horses, nothing until I'd brought her into my receiving hall and someone, Betton, I think, my steward's niece, quick enough to read a room without being told, had draped a blanket over her shoulders. Senna held it like a debt she resented owing. "You were on the hollow road," I said again, once the doors were shut and it was only the two of us and the fire and my steward Corin hovering near the archive door with the particular stillness of a man who has served 3 generations of my family and learned, in that time, exactly when to make himself useful by staying quiet. "That road has been closed since before I took the crown. Nobody uses it. Nobody outside my own council is even meant to remember it, exists as anything but an old story about smugglers." "I remember it," she said, "because I grew up walking it. My mother taught me every switchback on that mountain before I was old enough to be trusted with a blade of my own. Then men in your colors came and told her she wasn't allowed on it anymore. And then, a season later, they came again and told her something worse than that. The room got colder in a way that had nothing to do with the storm hammering the shutters. What was your mother's name? Why does it matter to a king what a dead huntress was called? Because I have a ledger in my archive that has never once made complete sense to me," I said. "No matter how many times I've read it, and something in the way you stand, like you're braced for a blow that hasn't landed yet, is making me think you might be the reason it never made sense." She went very still. Firelight moved across her face, and for the first time since the ridge she looked less like a woman who'd been dragged somewhere against her will, and more like a woman holding her breath at the edge of something she'd stopped believing would ever actually happen. That was when the token slipped loose. It fell from an inner pocket of her coat as she shifted the blanket higher against the chill, a small disc of old iron, black with tarnish, stamped with a sigil worn nearly smooth by handling, a road curving around a mountain, held fast in the jaws of a running wolf. It struck the stone floor with a sound too small for the silence it caused. Corin made a noise I had genuinely never heard him make in 11 years of service. He crossed the room faster than I'd have credited a man of his age with moving, and knelt, and did not touch the token, only stared at it, the color gone entirely out of his face. "Where," he said in a voice gone thin and strange, "did you get that?" It was my mother's. Senna's wariness had sharpened into something closer to alarm, watching both of us now, one hand drifting back toward the knife at her belt. She wore it every day of her life that I can remember, until the day she didn't come home. It is the only thing of hers I have left in this world. If you're about to tell me it's stolen, I'll tell you it was mine before it was ever anyone's business but hers. "It isn't stolen," Corin said, and looked up at me with an expression I'd only seen on him once before, the day my father died. "My lord, that is a warden's signet. There were 11 ever cast in the old days, one for each member of the order that guarded the hollow road and every pass that fed it. I catalogued the surrender of 9 of them myself, the season the order was disbanded. 2 were never recovered. I have spent 20 years assuming they were lost to the mountain, or melted down by whoever took them, or simply gone the way most things go when nobody's left who cares enough to keep looking." "Disbanded." Senna said the word like it tasted foul in her mouth. "Is that the word for it now? My mother had a different one. She called it the night a court she'd bled for hanged the word traitor on people who'd spent their whole lives keeping this kingdom's back roads safe, and never once let anyone stand up and ask why the charge didn't match a single true thing they knew about her. I sat because I found I needed to, and because standing over a stranger's grief while it filled my own hall, in front of a steward who'd gone the color of old parchment, felt like a second cruelty I wasn't willing to add to whatever the first one had already been. "Tell me everything you know," I said. "Start with her name." "Marin." The word came out of her rough-edged like it cost something every time she spent it. "Marin of the Hollow Road. Warden Captain. Before your father's council decided the wardens were selling passage to raiders instead of dying to keep them out. She never sold a single mile of that road to anyone in her life. She said so with the rope already round her sister warden's neck, and she kept saying it right up until they came for her too. I did not sleep that night, and I did not send her back out into the storm, whatever protocol demanded. I gave her a room with a locked door, locked from the outside, because I was not yet fool enough to pretend I trusted a stranger who'd held a knife on me 2 hours earlier, however much something in my chest was already arguing otherwise. And I took Corin down into the archive myself, the 2 of us hauling ledgers from a shelf that had gone 20 years without a hand disturbing its dust. I want to say I read the case against the wardens of the Hollow Road that night for the first time. That would be a lie, and I have grown tired in the years since of the number of small lies a court trains a man to tell without noticing he's telling them. I had read it before as a boy, half attending my father's lessons on the histories of his own reign, and again as a young alpha newly crowned, skimming it the way a man skims a document he's already decided doesn't need his full attention because someone wiser than him has already closed the matter. What I had never done, not once in either reading, was read it the way I read a disputed border claim or a merchant's falsified manifest, with the deliberate, suspicious patience of a man looking for the seam where a lie has been sewn into the truth. It did not take long to find it. The case against the wardens rested, in its entirety, on the sworn testimony of a single witness, a merchant named Desin Hale, then newly arrived in Emberhold's trade circles, who claimed to have seen Warden Captain Marin accept payment from raiders in exchange for safe passage through the northern switchback. No second witness. No physical evidence beyond a purse of coin Hale himself had produced, claiming to have recovered it from a dead raider's saddlebag. No cross-examination on record, though the transcript noted that one had been waived by the accused in the interest of expediency. 4 words that, the longer I stared at them, felt less like a fact and more like a man's signature forged onto a confession he'd never made. He waived nothing, I said, mostly to myself. My lord. 20 years, and nobody thought to ask how a merchant new enough to this court to still be learning our roads by name happened to be positioned, alone, to witness a crime on a mountain pass known for being nearly unwalkable at night. I turned the ledger toward Corin, tapping the line. And nobody thought to ask what happened to Dissin Hale's fortunes in the years that followed. Corin's face did the work of an answer before his mouth caught up to it. He holds 3 of the 4 northern trade concessions now, my lord, including the pass that was declared too dangerous for anyone but his own convoys to risk. A road too dangerous for the wardens who'd guarded it their whole lives, I said, but not too dangerous for the one man who profited from their fall. We sat with that in silence for a long moment. The fire burned down to coals, rain still going against the shutters like something patient and unhurried. I thought of Lord Dissin as I knew him now, 3 chairs down from my own at council, quick with a joke, quicker with a compliment, a man who always seemed to know which direction a conversation wanted to turn before it turned there, and who had, in 11 years of my reign, never once given me cause to look at him twice. I have prided myself, since I was young enough to be proud of very little else, on an instinct that reads a false account the way other men read weather, the small inconsistency, the sentence phrased to hide more than it reveals, the silence left where a true story would have had noise. I had walked past this particular falsehood for 11 years without once feeling its weight, and that failure sat in my chest that night heavier than almost anything I had done wrong as a king before or since. I sent for Senna before the sun was properly up. She came into the archive with her arms folded, and her jaw set in the particular way of someone braced to be told, gently and with great ceremony, that her mother's name would remain exactly as ruined as the court had left it, and that she should be grateful for having been fed and warmed for one night before being sent back to whatever forest had raised her. Instead, I turned the open ledger toward her and said, I don't believe your mother was a traitor. I think a man who now sits at my own council table traded her name, and 8 others besides, for a road he wanted for himself. And I think I have spent 11 years sitting 3 chairs down from him, without once asking the question my father's court should have asked before they ever tied the first rope. She looked at the ledger for a long time, long enough that I began to understand grief has its own kind of patience, one that doesn't hurry itself for anyone's convenience, not even its own. What happens now, she said finally, matters to me a great deal more than what a king believes in the privacy of his own archive. Belief doesn't clear a name, my lord. It just lets the man holding it feel better about the 20 years he spent not asking. Then I intend to make it matter, I said. Not belief, proof, laid out in front of the same court that convicted her, undone piece by piece until there's nothing left of the lie to stand on. But I'll need your help to do it properly, and I'll need you to trust me with things I suspect you've spent 20 years making sure no one could ever make you say out loud. Trust, she repeated, and something in the word was almost a laugh, though nothing in her face came close to smiling. You have a strange idea of how quickly that grows, for a man who's had it handed to him by everyone around him his whole life. I'm not asking you to trust me, I said. I'm asking you to let me prove something to you, the same way I'd want proven to me if it were my mother's name in that ledger instead of yours. Give me time. Give me the truth you're carrying. I'll do the rest, and if I fail, you'll have lost nothing you didn't already expect to lose. She studied me for a long moment, the kind of look I imagine her mother must have given raiders and courtiers alike, weighing exactly how much of a man's word could be trusted before the rest of him proved it worthless. 3 days, she said. You have 3 days before I decide this was one more thing your kind does to people like mine, and I take the road back into the mountains where it can't be done to me twice. It took 4 in the end, not 3. And I have told her since that the 4th day was the longest of my life, though I did not yet understand, standing in that cold archive with a false conviction unraveling in my hands, quite how much of my life had already quietly rearranged itself around the fact of her. We spent that first full day apart from each other and together in purpose, she walking the grounds under discreet watch, testing, I think, whether the hold's gates were as open as I'd claimed they'd be. I sending riders quietly north to the last known holding of anyone who'd served under the old order, and further riders east to the merchant registries, to trace exactly when and how Dissin Hale's fortune had begun its rise. I told no one at council what I was doing. I have learned in 11 years that a lie protected for 20 years does not lie down quietly. The moment someone begins pulling at its threads, it fights, and it fights hardest through the mouths of people who have the most to lose if it unravels. By evening, my riders had found her. Old Usselt, they called her in the hill villages, a woman well into her 70s now, who had once served the wardens as a runner between the outposts, carrying messages too sensitive for the regular roads. She lived alone at the far edge of the Verdance wilds, in a cottage that had clearly been chosen 20 years ago for how easily it could be abandoned in a hurry. I rode out myself, with Senna beside me. She had insisted, in a tone that made clear insisting was the only form the request would take, and Corin a length behind, carrying the ledger as though it might unravel further if left unattended. The Verdance wilds in autumn are not gentle country. The road narrowed twice into little more than a deer track, and twice I caught myself watching the tree line the way a man watches a room he suspects isn't as empty as it looks, though I could not have said, in either moment, exactly what I thought was watching us back. Senna rode with the ease of someone who had spent her whole life reading a forest the way I read a council chamber, and more than once she corrected our course before I'd have thought to question it. Once, quietly, pulling us off the main track entirely to skirt a stretch of ground gone soft with recent rain, the kind of ground, she said, that swallowed a horse's leg before a rider ever felt the warning. "You've done this before," I said. "Ridden this exact stretch, I mean." 100 times. My mother used to say the forest keeps better secrets than any court, because it never bothers pretending it doesn't have them. She glanced sideways at me. "You've been quiet since the ledger." "I've been thinking about how many small silences a man can walk through his whole life and call them settled matters." She didn't answer that, but she didn't ride ahead of me either, and something in the shared quiet that followed felt less like distrust than it had the night before. We reached Usselt's cottage as the light was starting to fail. She met us at her own door with a hatchet in her hand, and dropped it the instant her eyes found the signet at Senna's collar, where she'd taken, since the night before, to wearing it in plain sight rather than hidden away. "You have her eyes," the old woman said, before either of us had spoken a word, and then she was weeping openly, the hatchet forgotten at her feet, reaching for Senna's face with both trembling hands as though she needed to confirm with her fingers what her eyes had already told her. "Marin's girl. I heard you'd been raised wild in the hills and thought it was only a story the villages told each other. You have her exact eyes." It took the better part of an hour, and a great deal of gentleness I am not sure I would have found in myself a decade earlier, before Usselt would speak of what she'd seen. She had been the fourth witness the tribunal never called. She told us, present the night Dissin Hale first brought his accusation before the old council, present enough to know the coin purse he'd produced had not, in fact, come from any raider's saddlebag, because she had seen it, weeks before, in Hale's own hand, being weighed by a moneylender in the lower town. "I said nothing," she said, and her voice broke on the words in a way that told me the 20 years since had not made the saying any easier. "I was young and frightened, and Hale's men made it very clear what would happen to my own family if I stood up in that hall and called a rising merchant a liar. So I let a good woman hang for it instead, and I have not slept an easy night since, and I will tell you everything I know now tonight, because I am old enough that his men frightening me means considerably less than it used to." She wrote it out herself, by candlelight, in a hand gone shaky with age, but the words themselves clear and unwavering. a full confession of what she'd seen, and what she'd been threatened with for staying silent, and the moneylender's name besides. A man who, Corin confirmed within the hour by messenger, was still very much alive and still, as it happened, in possession of his own ledgers from that season. Senna said little through all of it, sitting very still with one hand resting on the old woman's shoulder, and it was only once we were back on the forest track, riding for home under a sky gone fully dark, that she let any of it show on her face at all. 20 years, she said, and it took 4 days for someone with a crown to ask the right question. I know, I said. I don't have a way to make that faster, only a way to make it stop mattering that it was slow. She didn't answer, but she rode close beside me the rest of the way home, closer than caution alone would have required, and something in my chest, that low, private hum I still didn't have a proper word for, settled into something steadier than it had been since the moment I'd first caught her scent on the ridge. The second piece came faster than I expected, and considerably more dangerously. Word reaches every corner of a hold eventually, no matter how quietly a king tries to move his riders, and by the third day it was clear Sin Hale had learned something was being asked about him that he did not want asked. He requested an audience with unusual urgency, all easy smiles and practiced concern, wanting to know, so he claimed, whether some trouble on the northern road required his convoys to take extra precaution. I gave him nothing. I have learned across 11 years that the surest way to make a guilty man show his hand is to let him believe you haven't yet seen it, and Sin Hale, for all his careful charm, was not half so unreadable as he believed himself to be. He left that audience with his smile a fraction too fixed, and within the hour Corin's own contacts in the lower town reported a rider dispatched north from Hale's estate at speed, carrying, we could only assume, some instruction meant to reach his strongbox before I did. We reached it first. I will not pretend that was entirely lawful or entirely comfortable, seizing a council lord's private holdings on the strength of an old woman's tearful confession, and a set of trade records is not the kind of thing any alpha does lightly, and I spent a sleepless night weighing whether I was about to unmake an innocent man's reputation on evidence that would collapse the moment it was examined by cooler eyes than mine. It did not collapse. Inside Sin Hale's strongbox, alongside coin and deed and correspondence that would take Corin a full week to properly catalog, sat a second signet, iron, tarnished, stamped with a road bent around a mountain, held fast in the jaws of a wolf, not hidden with any particular care. Kept, I understood with a kind of cold clarity, the way a man keeps a trophy he has never once expected to be asked to explain. He did not deny it when it was laid in front of him the following morning, in a private chamber with only myself, Corin, and 2 of my most trusted guards present. Men rarely do deny things well, once the proof has already made the argument for you far better than any confession could. He tried, for a moment, some halting story about having purchased it years ago from a trader of no fixed name, already fraying before it had finished leaving his mouth. And then he simply stopped talking, and looked, for the first time in 11 years of council meetings, like a man considerably smaller than the chair he'd been sitting in. 20 years, I said. You let this kingdom believe the warden sold it out to raiders, while you took their road and their fortune both, and sat 3 chairs from my own with a trophy from it in your own strongbox. He said nothing. There was nothing left by then worth saying. I called full council for the 4th evening, every lord and lady of standing seated, the hall lit with more lamps than I think it had held in a decade, because I wanted no shadow anywhere a lie might try to hide in it one last time. Senna stood at my side. She had refused, 3 separate times over the course of that day, to stand anywhere near the throne itself, and stood instead a pace to the left of it, arms folded, chin level, in a posture I had come, in 4 short days, to recognize as entirely her own and entirely her mother's at once. 20 years ago, I said, once the hall had settled, This court convicted the wardens of the Hollow Road of treason, on the word of a single witness, without cross-examination, without a second source, and without, as best as any record shows, a single person in this hall pausing to ask why the story didn't fit the women and men who'd told it. The murmur that rose was immediate, and I let it run its course before continuing, because a truth held silent for 2 decades is owed some noise on its way back out into the light. I have a written confession from a witness who was never called, describing coin planted to manufacture that testimony. I have trade records showing exactly how much that testimony was worth to the man who gave it. And I said, and here I nodded to Corin, who stepped forward with a small iron disc held flat on his open palm. The second warden's signet, missing for 20 years, recovered 3 days ago from Lord Dissin Hale's own strongbox. Where he kept it, I can only assume, because he never once believed anyone would come looking. Dissin, seated 3 chairs down, had gone the color of old wax. He did not rise. He did not speak. The silence he offered instead was, in its own way, as complete a confession as Usselt's written one. I cannot give the wardens their lives back, I said, turning from him to the hall at large, and finding, without meaning to, that my gaze had come to rest on Senna before I'd finished the thought. I cannot stand here and undo 20 years of a daughter growing up believing her mother's name would never again be spoken except as a warning to others. But I can give that name back to her, in front of every person in this hall who let the lie stand unquestioned for 2 decades. And I can make certain the man who built his fortune on 9 ruined lives answers for every mile of that road he ever profited from. I turned fully to Senna then, and the hall, to its credit, went quiet enough that I could hear the fire settling in the hearth behind us. Marin of the Hollow Road is cleared, I said, by my authority, before this whole court this hour, of every charge ever laid against her. And the Hollow Road itself is reopened, under a warden's authority again, the way it stood before anyone thought to close it, if she'll have it. Senna looked at the hall for a long moment before she looked at me, at the lords who had spent 20 years not asking a single hard question, at the empty space where 9 names had been left to rot under a lie none of them had troubled themselves to examine. Something in her seemed to settle then, the way a held breath finally, fully lets go. "I'll take the road back," she said, loud enough now that every corner of the hall could hear it. "Not for you, my lord, for her. She walked it her whole life believing it belonged to people who'd earned the trust to keep it safe. I intend to prove her right." "I wouldn't have wanted it answered any other way," I said, and meant it more completely than I had meant most things spoken from that chair in 11 years of speaking from it. Dissin Hale's holdings were stripped within the month, his trade concessions returned to the crown and, in time, to hands the warden's own descendants had a claim to. He did not stay in Emberhold to see the road reopened. I did not ask where he went, and I have never troubled myself to find out. Senna did not move into the hold that season, nor the one after. She kept her mother's cabin at the forest's edge, riding the Hollow Road most days with the same easy, unhurried authority I imagine Marin once carried along it. And I found, across that first year, considerably more reasons than duty alone required to ride that road myself rather than send anyone in my place. We spoke of small things, most days the weather turning, a washout needing repair, an old Warden Way station she thought worth restoring, and larger things on the days the small talk ran out. Her mother's history, my father's failures, the particular loneliness of being the last person left to carry a name no one else remembers correctly. There came an evening, a year and some months after that first storm on the ridge, when I found her standing at the old boundary stone where the road bends around the mountain's shoulder, turning her mother's signet over and over in her hand the way she still did whenever some thought was working itself loose in her. "I used to think this stone marked the place where the kingdom stopped trusting my family," she said, without turning, though she must have heard my horse a quarter mile off, the way she heard everything in that forest before it announced itself. I've started thinking lately, it might mark the place where it started trusting us again instead. I'd like to believe that's true, I said, coming to stand beside her, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, not quite. I think it will take longer than a year to be certain of it. Kings are supposed to be impatient people. You've been remarkably slow to hurry any of this along. I've found, I said, that the things worth being certain of are rarely the things worth rushing. She looked at me sideways then, something almost like a smile at the corner of her mouth, the first real one I'd seen there, I realized, in all the months I'd known her. My mother used to say something close to that, about the road, about most things really. Then I imagine I'd have liked her. I imagine she'd have made you work considerably harder to earn it than I have, Senna said, and this time the smile reached her whole face, brief and unguarded and entirely her own. Which is a thought that should probably frighten you more than it seems to. Nothing about this last year has frightened me, I said, except the thought of you deciding one morning that the forest suits you better than any road a king could offer you a place on. She didn't answer that directly. She only turned back to the mountain, the signet closed now in her fist, and let the quiet of the road, no longer forbidden, no longer a secret kept from anyone, say the rest of it for both of us, the way it had always, I think, been waiting to.